So hi everyone, and welcome to the making of the Heretic, a real-time short film made with Unity. We're presenting the work of the Unity demo team, and in the past we've made such demos as the Blacksmith, the Adam, and recently Book of the Dead. My name is Cupisz. I'm the tech lead on the Heretic production.
My name is Lasse, and I'm a senior software engineer.
So, in the past, when making demos,
doesn't look like much.
In the past, when making demos, we needed to build a lot of the fundamental things to achieve the high fidelity look that we were after. But nowadays, we have the HD render pipeline and the post-processing, which are pretty solid. So this time we're able to focus on tackling different issues. And in this demo, we mostly focused on human faces and VFX-driven characters. There's this, the demo we've shown so far, that's a preview, that's part one. And let's see what we've shown so far at GDC. So let's roll it. We can roll it.
This is the place. Doesn't look like much. Go take a look. Yeah, got it. Okay, here we go. So who exactly is this guy? You're kidding. They're a fairy tale, Boston. Don't be an idiot. I see it. Open it. Wait. Do it. Actually real. This makes no sense to me, Boston. but you might happen to be right.
So, if I can make the slide advance here. Sorry about that. All right, so the first part of this talk will be about the digital human, more specifically constructing the face of this character that we just saw in this film. So let's start with some numbers. The face has 28,000 vertices, 50,000 triangles, hundreds of blend shapes, more than 200 frames of 4D animation, which is photogrammetry per frame. That amounts to about 7 seconds of facial animation. And then there is, of course, a bunch of texture data. We have 4K maps for everything. So we have albedo, normal, cavity, thickness, etc. Everything that you would expect to be piped into something like this. In addition to that, we also have a lot of post-driven texture data, which means that we have a whole bunch of activation masks. We have 48 of them. Some of them are idle, and they drive 48 additional 4K maps that change the albedo, the normal, the cavity based on the expressions that the character is making. So let's look a bit at what are the parts that make up something like this. So the composition of the face. So first we have the skin. Here is the skin. And then we add eyes to that. Then teeth. I hope you can see that on the slides. They're quite dark. The mouth is a dark place. And then we have eyebrows. We have eyelashes. We have stubble. And then finally we have the tear line. So that's a lot of different parts that go into making something that doesn't look bad. Because when you're making something that tries to approach realism, best you can hope for is that it doesn't look bad, really. So, but these are the components, and these are the things that we had to do in order to have this human on the screen, both in terms of shading and in terms of animation. I will start talking about shading. So just to preface this, we are relying really heavily on HDRP, and HDRP is Unity's it's a scriptable render pipeline, so you can write your own, and HDRP is Unity's best bet on how you can render high-definition graphics with Unity. And it brings us lots of nice things out of the box that we didn't have to do in this demo, as Robert also mentioned. So we have really nice subsurface scattering from there based on a Disney Burley approach. There's also screen space reflections, physically based lighting, all sorts of nice things that you've come to expect today. With that being said, we also do have a lot of customizations that were made for this demo because HDRP didn't provide all the features we needed for the skin or all the features that we needed for the eyes, teeth, or tear line. So we made customizations, and we will try to get these into HDRP a little bit further down the line. So starting out with the skin shader. So the skin shader is based on what's called the stacklet shader in HDRP. The primary reason for this is that that was just an easy way for us to get the secondary specular lobe to break up the specular lighting on the skin. As mentioned, yeah, we're also getting subsurface scattering because that's just part of the package with HDRP. One of the customizations that we have in the skin shader is the post-driven features. So we're adding in wrinkles, etc., when the character is squinting or frowning his brow. And This is based on figuring out which of the activation masks are active based on some evaluation functions provided by a vendor, and then translating those into blend weights for all those 48 4K post-driven feature maps. The skin shader also adds specular occlusion in cavities, so we modulate the smoothness of the skin with that, and we also add specular occlusion, obviously, and then we also have some fade, so it doesn't show at grazing angles. Next, we have a custom shader for the eyes. So the eye shader, the input geometry is just the eye with the cornea, the bulge, and everything. The geometry defines the upper layer, and then we have a virtual plane for the iris so we refract the view ray in the cornea, and that hits the iris, and then we figure out, okay, now we are at that point on the iris. So the eye shader is a little bit interesting in the sense that it evaluates the light loop twice. That's how we did this two-layer material. So we gather the specular contribution from the surface of the eye and the cornea, and we gather the diffuse from the bottom layer, which means the iris and the bumpiness of the sclera. The eye shader is also interesting in the sense that it adds a light transform concept. So to light the eye, when you have a light that is an extreme angle to the face, you want to refract the incident direction of the light so that you actually get some light on the iris. We introduced the light transform concept in HDRP to help achieve this effect. The eyes also utilize marker-driven occlusion, and 4 markers on the skin are used to drive an anisotropic spherical Gaussian to give us a soft occlusion factor in the perimeter where the eyeball meets the skin. So regarding the eyes, I just want to give a shout out to one of our colleagues, Nicolas Francagio. He's not part of the demo team, but he did help us initially starting up the eye shader. So he came up with gathering specula from the upper layer, diffuse from the bottom. He was also authoring the anisotropic spherical Gaussian, and that was a great help. Also before HDRP had screen space reflections in the version provided to us, we had a custom one made by him. Next, we have the teeth shader. So this is just a derivative of HDRP lit, and that gives us the subsurface scattering again. The teeth shader is interesting to mention because this also uses marker-driven occlusion. So the mouth is dark, and to get a nice fall-off, we came up with a model where we say we define 6 points, or it could be more, but we've defined some points on the lips, and these points are then, like for each fragment within the mouth, and that includes the teeth, we project these points onto a hemisphere where they become a spherical polygon. Then we compute the area of this spherical polygon, and then we have an area which divided by the area of the hemisphere is an incidence factor of, you could think of it as the lit potential in that fragment. We just use it to fudge the occlusion. We actually go as far as just modulate the albedo with this factor, and it gives us this nice non-uniform fallout in different parts in the mouth. The shader is also applied to the tongue and the other interior of the mouth, just with a different diffusion profile for the scattering. Then we have the tear line, which is what connects the skin and the eyes a bit more than just the occlusion on the eyeball. So the tear line we are doing with a local blur. So we blur the normals and the smoothness values in the normal buffer, and the skin and eye shaders are aware of this process. So they write out in-depth prepass. There is a special normal writing option. We enable that, and we write out normals early. And then when they are actually shading, they read back what is then potentially blurred normal in that normal buffer. The way we do this is that we mark the region with a custom type of decal that just writes, hey, I want to blur the normals here into the stencil, and then we gather what wants to be blurred, masks out everything, and then does a separate pass that blurs those regions where the kernel shrinks towards the edge of the region. So we get this nice soft fall off towards the edge of the decal, and you can see how that comes out in the end with the tear line. So it's a screen space thing, and it gets the job done. So that's it for the custom shading features, but we also have a bunch of work done on animation for the face. We wanted to have realistic facial animation with a high granularity of motion in the face. So when a person is talking, there's lots of little muscle groups moving, and we expect that, and we need to have that in order for it to not feel plastic, or that parts of the face become like plastic in motion. And so we were trying to think about how can we avoid this. We knew that there's lots of blend shape based facial animation solutions out there, and they are all like rising really rapidly in quality. We were also thinking about maybe we can just take a different approach and see what that brings, and if that's interesting to do in practice. So we decided to try using 4D capture and playback. And 4D in this sense doesn't mean time or anything like, well, it actually does mean time. So it's just 3D models over time. So it's just one 3D capture of one 3D scan per frame. So this promises, this has like if you have a 3D scan per frame, of course, then that's essentially like a geometric photograph of your actor. And then you could say that this has the potential to be geometry accurate to the actor's performance. That's not really true, because there's a bunch of problems there. But at least you have some macro level motion that might be really difficult to reproduce just using blend shapes, even if you have thousands of them, because you would have to segment them so much. But I'm sure that will be solved eventually. Anyway, we went with the 4D thing, and as I mentioned, there were a bunch of technical challenges. So first of all, as I mentioned, the raw 4D data is like, you have this photorealistic skin geometry. That's great, but it also has a lot of missing sections, and it's also missing fine features. When you do a conventional 3D scan in a light stage, and you have this option of having multiple captures of the same pose, and maybe different exposure times, maybe different equipment, you're able to have much more detail in the normal maps, and you can also delight the albedos much more accurately. The 4D data that we worked with, it didn't have these features in it. And that meant that, okay, we needed to think about a way to bring those features back, but more about that later. So the missing sections, that's of course a problem. So it's necessary to clean the data, and where do we get the missing sections from? Imagine that in our case, the 4D capture was a recording of the face from the front. So the entire back of the face was missing. So we needed to transplant that, or this needed to be transplanted onto the clean 4D data that we were going to play back in the end. Also, to play it back in the first place, we needed to retopologize all those 4D frames to have the same topology as the neutral, so they could just be a deformation. So we wanted to go for having some changing geometry of the neutral face so that we could utilize all the high quality textures that we had in the first place. This was a long thought process, and also the 4D data, the raw 4D data exhibits a lot of noise, especially in regions where there is facial hair, and something like eyebrows just obscures the underlying skin geometry. So even if we have the clean 4D and everything is solved, there's no noise, all the parts are there, and the topology matches the neutral, we still don't have the fine features. But we were lucky enough to also work with a facial rig from a vendor that had these post-driven activation masks and maps. So we thought, why not just correlate these individual clean 4D frames with the best possible fit in the facial rig. So that's what we did. For each of the clean 4D frames, we figure out what's the combination of blend shapes that would approximate this frame the best. Then we get a set of blend shape weights. And those we just inject into our skin shader, and this gives us pose-driven normals, cavities, etc., even though we are playing back 4D animation. So here's an overview of the 4D pipeline. We have the actor's performance. A 4D capture was done, and a neutral, high-quality neutral and fax pose were produced by Infinite Realities. Then Russian 3D Scanner, another vendor, helped us clean up the 4D, and Snappers helped us build a facial rig. Then the correlation of the 4D frames and the blend shapes of the rig were combined by doing this data fitting. And that's a technical topic in its own right. But briefly, I can mention that we used a non-negative least squares method to find these blend shape weights for each of the 4D frames. So that's all fine. So we are done. No, we are not done, because now we have the clean 4D with the post-derivative features, but that's just the skin. What about the other parts, like hair? What actually needs to move with the skin? So we have eyebrows, we have eyelashes, we have stubble, we have the tear line blur region, we have markers on the eyelids for the occlusion, and we also have markers on the lips also for occlusion. And you could imagine other things, like let's say someone had an earring or a little dangling chain, a character that had some features like this. You would want to be able to attach them and evaluate where are they on this skin. And since we are throwing all this 4D data at it, we needed to find a way to do this. Luckily, in our case at least, all of this data is just points. So basically, we needed to resolve lots of points, because that was everything that in our case moves with the skin. The way we do this is that we build a system that allows us to build a list of poses for each point. And so we gather all the points from all the attached meshes for haircuts of eyebrows, meshes for eyelashes, meshes for the stubble. All of this is authored and then posed so that it aligns with the neutral. And then we build a system that, given this alignment and this data, extract a bunch of points, and then we would just say, okay, we would like to build local poses for these points, so that we later on, regardless of the deformation of the skin, could resolve the precision of these points and then feed them back into those meshes. So for each point, we find the closest vertex on the skin. You would think this is time-consuming, but just build an acceleration structure and it's not that bad. You can do it instantly for thousands, or tens of thousands of points. If you then look at the adjacency of the mesh, what we're doing is that we figure out what are the adjacent triangles, and then we compute the barycentric coordinates for the point that we're trying to attach and the distance to the plane of the triangle. That gives us a number of poses, and we store this number of poses for each point. Then at runtime, everything is a batch operation. There are no dependencies between the points. It's completely parallel, and we just fed it into C# jobs and burst, which made it go faster in an easy way. So we just batch resolve all the points from all the poses. All the data is completely sequential, and then we take those groups of points, like all the points that used to be the right eyebrow. We take those points and update the mesh with them. And this could also be done on the GPU. One of the reasons we didn't do that is because we needed to have logical markers, such as the markers for occlusion, and this code wasn't living in the GPU. But it would be an obvious thing just to accelerate that. But actually, with the burst, and it hasn't even been optimized that much, we are driving 429,000 poses. That then again drives 73,000 points. And that's the point cloud of the attachments on the face. So as this image reveals, he does actually have hair. It's just very, very short hair. he does have a lot of stubble, and the eyelashes are there as well. Speaking about eyelashes, for this system to work, if you want to have attached like longer strands of hair, that requires a bit more work, because normally you would want an eyelash to pivot around the root and not just the closest vertex for even given point along the strand. So to attach the eyelashes, we have a bit of a pre-pass in the build phase where we isolate the independent groups in the mesh that defines the eyelashes, and then we locate the roots of these independent groups. And then when we have located the roots, we find the closest vertex for each of those roots, and then we propagate those closest vertices to the tips of the lashes. And that's completely build time, or when you attach the mesh, it doesn't affect the runtime resolve because the points along the strands, they just get a different closest vertex, and that means that the triangles that they are calculating and post towards from, they're just further away, and that helps them stay straight. So that's it for my part right now. So for the future, I mentioned that we have about 7 seconds of 4D. That's not a lot of data. It was actually a lot of data in terms of just trying to figure out what to do in this pipeline. And obviously in the future, probably we will try and throw more data at it. And now I'm going to hand it over to Robert.
All right, so this bit will be about the VFX-driven character. Let's start with the concept art drawn by our concept artist Georgi. So from the beginning, it was pretty clear we wanted something that would be like a mechanical robot built with tech that doesn't exist now. That's highly reconfigurable. That's maybe a little bit threatening, very strong in appearance, and very physical, very heavy. And the trick was that it needed to be highly directable. All those forms, all those shapes, it couldn't just be a particle effect that explodes all over the place. So we started off with this super early exploration of the shape. It was hacked together. It was slow. It wasn't real time. Wasn't controllable in any way. But we managed to get like a roughly bird-shaped form, and so it seemed promising. So let's take a look at all the forms the system needed to support. So we had the animated bird form. We have the tentacles. The crawling tentacles, which like avoid obstacles and conform to surfaces with this kind of fluid-like motion. We have the leaping tentacles that fly through the air. The gauntlet, which is sort of a tactile interface on the arm, needs to follow it. And the dream catcher, the kind of the portal opening contraption. So first of the tentacle form, you see those kind of chains of meshes. These are animated by our animator, and very obviously we needed very precise control. They need to precisely grab a thing and move it and behave exactly the way we want. So to solve that, well, the first approach was pretty easy. If we assume that the wire needs to go through the control points, so the bone positions, we just use an Hermit spline. And that just gives us the right amount of smoothness and satisfies the condition that it goes through the control points. Next, if at every bone position we just offset it in a plane that's the mirror plane of the two adjacent bones, then we can get a bundle of wires. And then we can the twist can follow the twist of the bone, so that it's that it's animatable or even manually controlled, or it can be also automatic. And a bundle like that behaves pretty well under twists and turns. It's we'll pleasantly surprised how it behaves. So then we, of course, have a bunch of more tools on top of that. So you can adjust the trim, you can add the noise along, you have a radius variation curve, and you can of course change the distribution of the wires, how they're spawned from the on the disk, if it's a Fibonacci distribution or random distribution, or maybe just on the edges of it. That's another early exploration. We just added one of the wires is a chain of line lights, and then it's an emissive mesh. So the important bit was that we wanted to avoid simulation as much as possible, because simulation is very difficult to control, very difficult to direct, to explore what's going to happen. You have to kind of play through it every time. It doesn't work well with exploring lots of shapes, and it's definitely not scrubbable. So we wanted to go for something for a system where if we just know all the positions of the control points and all the parameters, we can just instantly evaluate the entire shape of the entire form. The way the wire rendering works is that initially we just pre-generate a single tube wire mesh, and in its data it stores the segment ID and where around on the ring the given vertex sits. Then every frame we run a bunch of animation computer shader kernels, and these basically run a thread per wire and then iterate over the wire and kind of try to satisfy all the constraints. Next up, the next stage is based on the buffer from the previous stage. This one just generates the tangent frame for every position of every segment. Then the tube meshes are instantiated, and the regular lit shader just has a modded vertex stage where the vertex stage then knows about which instant it is, which segment, and where on the segment the vertex lies, and then it uses it to look up into the position and tangent frame buffers to kind of explode the mesh and put it in the right place. And only the animation stage, that's the only stage that needs to know anything about the behavior. Everything else is shared. So next up we have the crawling form. And this one is a bit tricky because we wanted lots of interesting emergent behavior, flow-like, but that would also be very directable. So we still needed the robot to go where we wanted to. And this is a pretty good example of one of the early tests as it conforms to that shape. But it very quickly degenerates on the back side of the column. So that's sometimes useful, sometimes not so much. That's a better example where we have the tentacle, and the tentacle kind of retains its form, but whenever it gets close to an obstacle, it reacts in very, in a bunch of interesting shapes that we didn't have to kind of manually create. So to get the movement to look interesting, one of the ways is to make it look like a flow. But we didn't really want to kind of animate that, of course. And when flowing, we still wanted to retain the directability. So here you see the wires, they're flowing down the stairs, but at the same time, they're still kind of trying to match their shape to the positions on the bones. So, a change of topic. Every smooth vector field can be decomposed into its harmonic, curl, and divergence parts. And the harmonic and curl are fine, but divergence is not so nice when you're dealing with flow. If we're talking about liquid, that would mean either creation or destruction of liquid at the point that would have non-zero divergence. And historically, generating divergence-free fields were very expensive. But this paper by Ivan de Wolf introduces this super nice way of just quickly generating them. So if we assume that we have two vector fields which have zero curl, those U and V, then just a cross product of the two has zero divergence. And a way to get a vector field with zero curl is just to take any scalar field, f, and take its gradient. And the gradient will always have zero curl. We can also substitute the one of the scalar noise fields with an SDF, a sign distance field. And that will result in a vector field that has this flow-like divergence-free behavior, but at the same time it follows the isosurfaces of your models and your geometry, which is exactly what we wanted. This is the SDF for the corridor. So there was a bunch of practicalities in actually using it. So if you're trying to follow a vector field that's curved, and you want to stick to an isosurface, just stepping along a tangent will obviously mean that every time you're kind of actually leaving the isosurface, so you need to pull back. You need to blend following the bone chain with following the SDF and so on. Next up is the leaping form. And that one is actually, again, just a bundle of wires, but this time we added those local modifier cylinders, which can apply extra force to the wires. So they can pull the wires along, pull them towards the center, and in this case it's pulling them towards the center and twisting them at the same time. The cylinder can also add forces along, actually this is a highly divergent vector field, which means that the wire starts clumping together. That's the gauntlet form, the tactile interface on the arm, and again it's a bunch of wires following a bone chain, so just basically parented to the arm, spawned only on the circumference, and then with just a bunch of modifiers which make sure that they conform to that they match the radius at every point. And all those interesting shapes are generated basically in 2.5D. So the arm is unwrapped, the wires are spawned along one of the edges and pushed across the rectangle. And on the way, they encounter the same modifier cylinders that you've seen so far, which try to twist them and move them to the sides and so on. And there's also a map, which is effectively a bump map, so it kind of adds bumps to the to get this kind of map-like look. The Dreamcatcher form, that one again uses a bunch of similar techniques, just applied differently with a bunch of tweaks. So first we have this bone chain that has just a large radius on one end and a small on the other. We duplicate it a bunch of times. Then we add modifier cylinders, and this one just pushes the center away. And the outer one, so the outer one has two radiuses, the inner one, and then only then the influence starts, and then it goes all the way up to the outer, and that one adds the twist and a little bit of pull as well. And then again, we have a cylinder that only affects the outer wires, and that one tries to clamp them. So again, it is just a gradient of a simplex noise, which is divergent. So it results in clamps and spreads it nicely. Working with those fields is really nice, normally. The problem is that they have lots of bifurcations. So a very small change to initial parameters means that like a very large qualitative change further down the line. So even if we move the emitter slightly or change parameters very slightly, the end might behave very jittery, and the end wires might move too quickly and look flickery and just not very physical, right? You don't have infinite acceleration in real life. So normally we would just get around it by pushing the wires forwards, which completely avoids that issue. In this case, it's actually like a linear emitter, which moves sideways, but we're snapping the emission positions of the wires to almost the neighbor, but not quite, which means that the wires effectively seem like they're moving much slower than the emitter, and that also kind of makes the look much calmer. Finally, the bird form, and that one is kind of we thought that we could use the same approach as with the environment, with the only difference that we would dynamically generate the SDF and everything will work perfectly. So we use this approach that starts off with the technique from TressFX by AMD, where we kind of in a compute kernel for every triangle we spawn a thread, and that thread splats the distance to the given triangle in its AABB. And then the resulting buffer will have distances, but just around the surface of the mesh. So then the next step is to use to flat fill the rest of the volume, and we do it in some cases either with linear or jump flatting. And it was, the first implementation was surprisingly nice, under 0.4 milliseconds for 64 cubed voxels on a 1080 Ti for this kind of mesh. And this is just a random test to see if, you know, fun when remarching, just to see if kind of it's smooth and just to play around with it. We could also plug that dynamic SDF into the VFX graph in Unity and have particles follow it. So the thing is that doesn't actually work, because the bird animates so quickly, and as we've learned, even small changes to parameters mean that the wires could go all over the place. That means it was just so jittery that it was completely unusable. So instead, we decided to only use the SDF from the bind pose of the bird. So you see the SDF of the skin, and then wrap the wires around that SDF again, still in the bind pose. And that's done, basically there's a bunch of those line emitters and rectangular emitters as well. And we kind of dress up the bird with the wires. And just another shot of the kind of wires following the isosurfaces. And the last stage is to skin the thing. So we can't use regular skinning because the wires can travel across the skin, so they don't have a fixed bone that they would have to follow. So instead, we have this volumetric skinning, where initially in the bind pose, in a volume of voxels, for every voxel we store which bone and bone weights this voxel is the closest to, and then later on, when the bird animates, we just look up for each point on the wire which bone and which weights this point on the wire should skin to, and that's how the skinning works. So you see, it introduces a bunch of kind of discontinuities, like those, the lines kind of break up. This is the basically, you know, the edges of the voxels, but it still kind of fits with the concept, so it's fine. So future work for this thing includes, you know, more transitions between forms. But also the interesting bit will be to try to recreate it in the VFX graph. That one was created in Unity after we were like more than halfway through with the creation of Boston. But now it's kind of, it's the time to try it out, and it will be an interesting experiment because we will be able to leverage the code generation that's built into the VFX graph. So all the animation kernels could just kind of, you know, you group them as visual blocks, but then they get generated into one compute kernel. And that's it from us. If you have any questions, just grab us after the presentation, please. Thanks.